The sun was setting over the bustling market of Ouagadougou when Alino Faso made his final speech. Standing on a wooden crate, his voice carried across the crowded square where hundreds of people had gathered. Women balancing colorful bowls on their heads stopped to listen. Children playing between the market stalls grew quiet. Even the merchants selling fabric and spices paused their haggling to hear what the young activist had to say. Alino was only 28 years old, but his words carried the weight of someone who had lived through decades of struggle. He wore a simple white shirt and dark pants, nothing fancy, but his presence commanded attention. His eyes sparkled with passion as he spoke about the corruption that was strangling their country. He talked about government officials who stole money meant for schools and hospitals. He described how foreign companies were taking their natural resources while leaving the people with nothing. "We are not poor because God made us poor," Alino declared, his voice rising above the evening breeze. "We are poor because greedy people steal what belongs to us all." The crowd murmured in agreement. Many nodded their heads, recognizing the truth in his words. Alino had grown up in a small village outside the capital. His father was a farmer who struggled to grow crops on land that was becoming drier each year. His mother sold vegetables in the local market, counting every coin to make sure her family could eat. Like many children in his village, Alino had to walk 5 miles to reach the nearest school. The building was old and crowded, with one teacher trying to teach 60 students at once. But Alino was different from other children. He was curious about everything. He asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. Why didn't their village have clean water when the government promised to build wells? Why did children in the capital have better schools while village children learned under trees? Why did politicians live in big houses while families struggled to find food? When Alino finished school, he moved to the capital city. He worked during the day as a mechanic, fixing old cars and motorcycles. But in the evenings, he attended university classes. He studied politics and economics, trying to understand why his country remained poor, despite having gold mines and fertile land. The more he learned, the angrier he became. He started writing articles for small newspapers, exposing corruption and demanding change. He organized peaceful protests, bringing together students, workers, and farmers. His followers called him the voice of the people, because he said what everyone was thinking but was afraid to say out loud. The government didn't like Alino's growing influence. They tried to ignore him at first, hoping he would disappear like other activists before him. But Alino was persistent. His movement grew stronger each month. People from different ethnic groups and religions united behind his message of justice and equality. As Alino finished his speech that evening in the market, he looked out at the sea of faces before him. Old men with weathered hands clapped enthusiastically. Young mothers holding babies smiled hopefully. University students cheered and raised their fists in solidarity. "Tomorrow we march to the presidential palace," Alino announced. "We will demand that our leaders listen to the people. We will show them that we are not afraid." The crowd erupted in celebration, singing traditional songs and dancing in the dusty square. But in the shadows at the edge of the market, 3 men in dark suits watched silently. They had been following Alino for weeks, reporting his every move to their bosses in the government. One of them spoke quietly into a small radio, describing what they had witnessed. The response from the other end was brief but clear. As the crowd began to disperse and vendors packed up their goods for the night, Alino walked home through the narrow streets of the old quarter. He lived in a small apartment above a bakery, where the smell of fresh bread filled the air each morning. His neighbors were poor but proud people who worked hard to support their families. Alino climbed the stairs to his room, unaware that his words that evening had sealed his fate. He spent the night writing in his journal, planning the next day's march and dreaming of a better future for his country. He wrote about his vision of schools in every village, hospitals with medicine, and roads that connected remote areas to markets in the cities. Outside his window, the city gradually fell silent. Street vendors went home to their families. Night watchmen began their shifts. In government offices across the capital, however, lights burned late into the night as officials made urgent phone calls and signed secret documents. None of them knew that Alino Faso's death, which would come just 12 hours later, would spark a revolution that would change not just their country, but all of West Africa forever. The young mechanic who had become the voice of his people was about to become something much more powerful in death than he had ever been in life. By the 5th week after Alino's death, the impossible was happening across West Africa. Governments that had seemed unshakable for decades were beginning to crack under the pressure of sustained popular resistance. The revolution that began with one man's dream of justice had grown into a force that could no longer be ignored or suppressed. The first major breakthrough came in Burkina Faso itself. President Compaoré, isolated and facing mutiny within his own security forces, made a desperate attempt to save his presidency by announcing he would dialogue with protest leaders. But it was too late. The Alino Faso movement, now led by a council of his former supporters, rejected any negotiations that didn't include his immediate resignation. Ibrahim, who had emerged as the movement's primary spokesperson, addressed a crowd of over 100,000 people gathered in Independence Square. The same place where Alino had given his final speech now overflowed with citizens demanding change. Alino died calling for justice, Ibrahim declared, his voice hoarse from weeks of speeches and chanting. Justice means those responsible for his murder must face trial. Justice means free elections. Justice means a new constitution that protects the rights of all citizens, not just the wealthy and powerful. The crowd roared its approval, waving handmade flags and banners covered with Alino's image. Many people had traveled from rural villages, walking for days to join the historic gathering. Farmers, teachers, students, and market vendors stood shoulder to shoulder, united in their demand for fundamental change. That same evening, Colonel Sankara made the announcement that changed everything. In a televised address to the nation, he declared that the military would no longer support President Compaoré's government. Instead, they were placing the president under house arrest and calling for a transitional government to organize free elections. The blood of Alino Faso and other innocent citizens is on our hands. Colonel Sankara admitted to the nation, "We took an oath to protect the people of this country, but we have failed in that sacred duty. Today we choose to stand with the people against tyranny." The news spread quickly across the region through social media, radio broadcasts, and word of mouth. In Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, and Mali, protesters celebrated the victory in Burkina Faso as their own. They saw it as proof that organized, peaceful resistance could topple even the most entrenched dictatorships. But the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that the real work was just beginning. Overthrowing a corrupt government was only the first step in building the kind of democratic society Alino had envisioned. In the weeks that followed Compaoré's removal, a remarkable transformation began taking place in Burkina Faso. The transitional government, led by civilian leaders chosen by the protest movement, immediately launched investigations into corruption and human rights abuses. They opened government budgets to public scrutiny for the first time in decades. Mama Traoré, who had become a symbol of the resistance through her daily vigils, was invited to serve on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, tasked with investigating Alino's death and other government crimes. Despite having no formal education, her moral authority and connection to the people made her voice essential in the healing process. "We must know the truth about what happened to our son," she told the commission during its first public hearing. "But we must also forgive, so that our children can live in peace." The investigation revealed the extent of the government's surveillance and intimidation of activists. Documents seized from security offices showed that Alino had been marked for elimination weeks before his death. The evidence implicated several high-ranking officials, including General Ouedraogo, who was arrested and charged with murder. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of the Burkina Faso revolution continued to spread throughout West Africa. In Senegal, the government announced it would not seek to extend presidential term limits, a key demand of protesters who had been inspired by Alino's movement. Opposition parties that had been banned were allowed to register for elections. In Nigeria, massive protests led to the resignation of several corrupt governors and the establishment of new anti-corruption agencies with real power to investigate and prosecute officials. University students who had organized solidarity rallies for Alino found themselves at the center of a broader movement for educational reform and youth empowerment. Ghana experienced perhaps the most dramatic changes. The ruling party, facing massive demonstrations and international pressure, agreed to constitutional reforms that strengthened democratic institutions and limited executive power. They also established a truth commission modeled on the one in Burkina Faso, to investigate past abuses. The regional transformation wasn't limited to politics. Economic changes began emerging as well. Young entrepreneurs, inspired by Alino's message of self-reliance and dignity, started businesses aimed at solving local problems rather than just making profits. Cooperatives formed to help small farmers get better prices for their crops. Technology hubs emerged in major cities, focusing on innovations that could improve governance and transparency. Women played an increasingly prominent role in the post-Alino political landscape. In country after country, female activists who had supported the movement found themselves elected to parliaments and appointed to government positions. They brought fresh perspectives on issues like education, healthcare, and social justice that had been neglected by previous male-dominated governments. The international community watched these changes with a mixture of hope and concern. Western governments that had long supported stable dictatorships in the name of security and economic interests found themselves scrambling to adapt to the new reality of empowered citizenries demanding accountability. Some international observers worried that the rapid political changes might lead to instability or conflict. But the movements inspired by Alino's death remained remarkably disciplined in their commitment to nonviolent change. Leaders consistently preached reconciliation rather than revenge, following the example set by Alino himself in his final speech. Religious and traditional leaders across the region played crucial roles in maintaining peace during the transitions. They organized interfaith dialogues, mediated disputes between different political groups, and helped communities heal from years of division and mistrust. The African Union, initially hesitant to support the protest movements, eventually embraced the changes as evidence of the continent's democratic maturation. They provided technical assistance for elections and constitutional reforms, helping ensure that the transitions would be successful and sustainable. As the first anniversary of Alino's death approached, it was clear that his sacrifice had unleashed forces of change that extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The young mechanic who had dreamed of clean water for his village had inspired a continental awakening that was reshaping the political map of West Africa. 3 weeks after Alino's death, the revolution had spread far beyond anyone's imagination. What started as grief in one small country had become a wave of change washing over all of West Africa. In capital cities from Lagos to Dakar, protesters carried pictures of the young activist who had died for speaking truth to power. In Ghana, the connection to Alino's movement was particularly strong. Kwame Asante, a taxi driver in Accra, had grown up hearing stories about similar struggles in neighboring countries. When he saw footage of the peaceful march that ended in bloodshed, something inside him snapped. If they can kill someone for asking for clean water and good schools, then none of us are safe, he told his passengers. Kwame organized his fellow drivers to refuse service to government officials. Soon, hundreds of taxis and buses displayed small stickers with Alino's face and the words, "Never again," written in local languages. The transport workers' solidarity inspired other groups to take action. Market women in Kumasi, Ghana's second-largest city, began wearing white head wraps in memory of Alino's white shirt. They sang songs about him while selling their goods, turning daily commerce into acts of remembrance and resistance. The simple gesture spread to markets across the country, creating a visible symbol of unity that the government couldn't suppress without appearing even more oppressive. In Nigeria, Africa's most populous nation, university students had been dealing with their own problems of corruption and poor governance. When news of Alino's death reached Lagos, student leaders saw an opportunity to connect their struggles with the broader movement for change sweeping the region. Adenike Okafor, a political science student at the University of Lagos, organized solidarity rallies that drew thousands of participants. "Alino Faso died fighting the same battles we fight every day," she proclaimed from the steps of the university library. Corrupt leaders who steal our money, police who brutalize innocent people, and governments that ignore the needs of young people. The Nigerian protests took on their own character, focusing heavily on unemployment and the lack of opportunities for educated youth. Young graduates who couldn't find jobs despite their degrees saw Alino's story as proof that their leaders had failed them across the entire region. But it was in Senegal where Alino's influence created the most dramatic political changes. The country had been ruled by the same political party for over 40 years, and many citizens felt trapped in a system that benefited only the wealthy elite. When protesters in Dakar began chanting Alino's name during their demonstrations, the government made a critical mistake. They tried to ban any mention of the deceased activist. The ban backfired spectacularly. Instead of stopping the protests, it made Alino's name even more powerful. People began wearing T-shirts with his picture, writing his quotes on walls and naming their newborn children after him. The government's attempt to erase his memory only made him more present in people's daily lives. Aminata Ba, a seamstress in Dakar, began making cloth with Alino's image printed on it. The fabric became so popular that women across the city wore dresses and headscarves featuring the fallen activist's face. "He is our brother," Aminata explained to a journalist. "His struggle is our struggle. His dream of justice belongs to all of us." The economic impact of the regional protests was becoming impossible to ignore. Foreign investors grew nervous about the instability, pulling money out of stock markets and canceling development projects. Tourism declined as travelers avoided countries experiencing political upheaval. Even international organizations began pressuring governments to address the protesters' demands. In Mali, where the government had been fighting armed rebels in the north, the southern regions erupted in peaceful demonstrations inspired by Alino's movement. The protesters demanded not just political reforms, but also better security and economic opportunities that would address the root causes of conflict. Traditional chiefs and religious leaders across the region began speaking with one voice for the first time in decades. They issued joint statements calling for an end to the violence against protesters and urging governments to listen to the legitimate grievances of their people. The African Union, initially reluctant to interfere in member countries' internal affairs, finally called for an emergency session to address the crisis. Pressure was building from international partners who were concerned about regional stability and human rights violations. Back in Burkina Faso, President Compaoré's government was crumbling under the weight of constant protests and international pressure. Several cabinet ministers had resigned, claiming they could no longer support the president's hardline approach to the crisis. Even members of the military were beginning to question their orders to suppress peaceful demonstrators. General Ouedraogo, who had promised to end the protests within a week, found himself increasingly isolated. His brutal tactics had only strengthened the resolve of the protesters and turned international opinion against the government. Soldiers were reluctant to fire on crowds that now included their own family members. The breaking point came when a group of prominent military officers issued a public letter criticizing the government's handling of the crisis. Led by Colonel Sankara, the same officer who had been present at Alino's death, the military leaders called for dialogue and peaceful resolution of the conflict. "We joined the army to protect our people, not to shoot them," Colonel Sankara wrote in the letter. "The death of Alino Faso weighs heavily on our consciences. We cannot continue to be instruments of oppression against our own brothers and sisters." International media coverage intensified as reporters from around the world descended on West Africa to document the unprecedented regional uprising. The story of a young mechanic who had become a symbol of hope for millions captured global attention and sympathy. French President Emmanuel Macron, whose country had significant economic interest in the region, publicly called for restraint and dialogue. The United States State Department issued statements supporting peaceful protesters and condemning violence against civilians. Even China, usually reluctant to comment on African political affairs, expressed concern about the situation. As the fourth week of protests began, it was clear that Alino Faso's death had created something much larger than anyone had anticipated. His name had become a rallying cry for change across an entire continent. The young man who had dreamed of a better future for his village had inadvertently sparked a movement that was reshaping the political landscape of West Africa. The night after Alino's death, no one in Ouagadougou slept peacefully. In every neighborhood, people gathered in small groups, whispering angrily about what they had witnessed. The government had imposed a curfew, but that didn't stop citizens from meeting secretly in their homes, planning what to do next. Fatima Diallo, a nurse who had worked at the clinic where Alino died, couldn't stop thinking about his final moments. She had tried desperately to save his life, pressing bandages against his wound while he whispered his last words. "Tell them," he had gasped. "Tell them not to give up." Now she felt responsible for carrying his message forward. At the university, students were organizing something the country had never seen before. Musa Keita, the student body president, had called an emergency meeting in the largest lecture hall. Despite the risks of defying the curfew, over 500 students showed up. The room buzzed with angry voices and passionate speeches about justice and revenge. "They think they can silence us with bullets," Musa declared from the podium. "But we are not afraid anymore. Alino died for our future, and we will not let his sacrifice be wasted." The students decided to organize a massive strike. They would boycott all classes and encourage workers across the city to join them. They printed thousands of flyers on the university's copying machines, working through the night to spread their message throughout the capital. Meanwhile, in the presidential palace, emergency meetings continued behind closed doors. President Compaoré paced nervously in his office while his advisors argued about how to handle the crisis. Some suggested arresting all of Alino's known followers. Others recommended making public statements claiming the shooting was an accident. "This was supposed to end the problem, not make it worse," the president shouted at his security chief. "Now we have a dead hero on our hands, and the people are angrier than before." The security chief, a cold man named General Ouedraogo, remained calm. "We will control the situation, Mr. President. Give me 1 week and this will all be forgotten." But General Ouedraogo had seriously underestimated the power of Alino's death to unite people. By the 3rd day after the shooting, something extraordinary was happening across the country. Workers in the gold mines stopped digging. Teachers refused to enter their classrooms. Even government clerks began calling in sick to work. The strike spread beyond the capital to small towns and villages throughout the country. Farmers refused to sell their crops to government buyers. Market women closed their stalls. Bus drivers parked their vehicles and joined protest marches instead of following their routes. But the most surprising development was how quickly news of Alino's death spread to neighboring countries. In Ghana, university students organized solidarity marches in support of their fellow Africans. In Mali, radio stations played songs dedicated to the fallen activist despite government warnings to stop. In Senegal, opposition leaders gave speeches comparing Alino to great freedom fighters of the past. Social media, which was still new to many people in West Africa, played a crucial role in spreading Alino's story. Young people with access to computers and phones shared photos and videos from the day of the shooting. They created hashtags in local languages that translated to "Justice for Alino" and "The people will not be silenced." A video recorded by a student journalist became particularly powerful. It showed Alino's final speech in the market, followed by footage of the peaceful march and then the chaos when soldiers opened fire. The video ended with images of Alino's body being carried by his supporters, blood staining his white shirt. International news organizations began paying attention to what was happening in this small West African country. BBC, CNN, and Al Jazeera sent reporters to cover the growing protests. Suddenly, the world was watching as ordinary people stood up to their oppressive government. The government tried to control the narrative by shutting down internet access and arresting journalists. But their heavy-handed tactics only made people more determined to resist. When they couldn't post online, activists painted messages on walls. When they couldn't hold large gatherings, they organized smaller groups that met in different locations throughout the city. Mama Traoré, Alino's former landlord, became an unlikely symbol of the resistance. Every morning she sat outside the clinic where he had died, holding a photograph of him and refusing to move despite police threats. Other elderly women joined her, creating a daily vigil that attracted hundreds of supporters. "He was like my son," Mama Traoré told a foreign journalist who interviewed her. "The government took my son from me, but they cannot take his ideas from our hearts." Religious leaders also began speaking out against the government's actions. The imam at the central mosque gave a sermon about justice and defending the innocent. The Catholic archbishop issued a statement calling for a peaceful transition of power. Even traditional chiefs, who usually stayed out of politics, began criticizing the president's handling of the crisis. But perhaps the most significant development was the formation of the Alino Faso movement by his former followers. Led by Ibrahim, the young man who had caught Alino when he fell, The movement organized coordinated protests across multiple cities simultaneously. They developed secret communication networks and trained peaceful protesters in nonviolent resistance techniques. The movement's manifesto was simple, but powerful. It demanded an investigation into Alino's death, prosecution of those responsible, and immediate democratic reforms including free elections, press freedom, and an end to corruption. "We do not seek revenge," Ibrahim announced at a clandestine press conference. "We seek justice. We do not want to destroy our country. We want to build a better one, just as Alino dreamed." As the protests entered their second week, it became clear that something fundamental had changed in the country. The fear that had kept people quiet for years was gone, replaced by a determination to create the kind of society Alino had envisioned. His death had become the spark that ignited a revolution, and there was no stopping it now. The morning of March 15th started like any other day in Ouagadougou. Street sweepers cleared dust from the main roads while early risers hurried to work. The aroma of coffee and fried plantains drifted from roadside stalls as the city slowly awakened. But by the time the sun reached its highest point, everything would change forever. Alino woke up at 6 in the morning, as he did every day. He said his prayers, washed his face with water from a plastic bucket, and put on his cleanest shirt. Today was the day of the big march to the presidential palace. He had been planning this moment for months, and he felt both nervous and excited. His landlord, Mama Traore, knocked on his door with a plate of warm bread and tea. She was a widow who had treated Alino like her own son since he moved into the apartment 2 years earlier. "You be careful today, my boy," she said, worry creeping into her voice. "I heard people talking in the market. They say the government is angry about your speeches." Alino smiled and took her weathered hands in his. "Don't worry, Mama, we are only going to talk. We want peace, not violence." But even as he said the words, he felt a strange uneasiness in his stomach. Something didn't feel right about this morning. By 9 o'clock, hundreds of people had gathered in Independence Square, the same place where their country had celebrated freedom from colonial rule decades earlier. They came from all walks of life. Teachers carried signs demanding better schools. Farmers held banners protesting unfair taxes. Students chanted songs about justice and equality. Alino stood before the crowd, feeling the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. These people trusted him to lead them safely to the presidential palace. They believed in his vision of a better country where everyone could live with dignity. "My brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying across the square through a borrowed megaphone. "Today we walk not as enemies of our government, but as patriots who love our country. We go to remind our leaders that they work for us, not the other way around." The crowd cheered and began moving slowly through the streets. They walked peacefully, singing traditional songs and carrying handmade signs. Children ran alongside the marchers, laughing and enjoying the festive atmosphere. It felt more like a celebration than a protest. But as the procession approached the government district, the mood began to change. Police officers lined the streets wearing riot gear and carrying shields. Armored vehicles blocked several intersections. The marchers slowed their pace, sensing the tension in the air. When they reached the gates of the presidential palace, a line of soldiers stood waiting. The officer in charge, Colonel Sankara, stepped forward with a bullhorn. "This gathering is illegal," he announced. "You have 10 minutes to disperse and return to your homes." Alino walked to the front of the crowd and raised his hands for silence. "We have the right to petition our government," he called out to the colonel. "We came here peacefully. We only want to deliver a letter to the president asking for dialogue." For a moment, it seemed like the situation might resolve itself peacefully. Colonel Sankara appeared to be considering Alino's words. Some of the soldiers lowered their weapons slightly. The crowd waited hopefully, holding their breath. But then a black Mercedes pulled up behind the line of soldiers. 2 men in expensive suits got out and walked quickly to where Colonel Sankara was standing. One of them whispered urgently in the colonel's ear while pointing at Alino. The colonel's expression hardened and he nodded grimly. What happened next would be debated for years to come. Some witnesses said they heard a gunshot from the crowd first. Others insisted the shooting began when soldiers opened fire without warning. But everyone agreed on one thing. Chaos erupted in seconds. People screamed and ran in all directions. Parents grabbed their children and looked for places to hide. The peaceful march turned into a terrifying stampede as bullets flew through the air. Alino tried to calm the crowd, shouting for everyone to stay together and move slowly. Then a single shot rang out, louder and clearer than the others. Alino stumbled forward, a look of surprise on his face. He pressed his hand to his chest and saw blood seeping through his white shirt. He tried to speak, to tell his followers to remain peaceful, but the words wouldn't come. Mama Traore's son, Ibrahim, who had been marching near the front, caught Alino as he fell. "Help him!" Ibrahim screamed, but the shooting continued around them. Several other marchers formed a protective circle, trying to carry their wounded leader to safety. They managed to get Alino to a nearby clinic, but it was too late. The doctor, tears in his eyes, pronounced him dead at 2:47 in the afternoon. The bullet had pierced his heart, killing him almost instantly. News of Alino's death spread through the city like wildfire. People who had been at work or school dropped everything and rushed to the clinic. By evening, thousands had gathered outside, crying and singing mourning songs. They lit candles and placed flowers on the ground, creating a memorial that stretched for blocks. But the grief quickly turned to anger. People began asking hard questions. Why had the government used live ammunition against peaceful protesters? Who had ordered the soldiers to shoot? And most importantly, who had fired the bullet that killed their beloved leader? As night fell over Ouagadougou, something had awakened in the hearts of the people. Alino Faso was dead, but his message was more alive than ever. The government thought they had silenced the voice of the people, but they had actually created something far more dangerous. A martyr whose death would inspire millions across West Africa to demand change. 1 year after Alino Faso's death, West Africa had become a different place entirely. The transformation was visible everywhere, from bustling markets where vendors freely discussed politics without fear, to schools where children learned about democracy and human rights as core subjects. On the anniversary of that tragic day in Ouagadougou, millions of people across the region participated in peaceful commemorations. They gathered in town squares, lit candles in his memory, and reflected on how much their societies had changed since a young mechanic decided to speak truth to power. In Burkina Faso, the site where Alino fell had been transformed into a memorial park called the Garden of Justice. Visitors from across Africa came to see the simple stone monument inscribed with his most famous quote, "We are not poor because God made us poor. We are poor because greedy people steal what belongs to us all." Mama Traore, now in her 70s but still energetic, served as the park's official guardian. Every morning she tended to the flowers planted around the memorial and welcomed visitors who wanted to learn about Alino's story. School groups regularly visited, and she would tell them about the humble young man who had lived above her bakery and dreamed of a better world. "He was just an ordinary person like you and me," she would tell the children, "but he had an extraordinary heart that felt the pain of his people. That's what made him special. Any of you could be like Alino if you care enough about others." The political changes across the region had exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. In Burkina Faso, free elections had brought to power a coalition government led by former activists and civil society leaders. The new president, a woman who had been a teacher before joining the movement, implemented sweeping reforms in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. Villages that had never had clean water finally got wells. Schools were built in remote areas where children had previously learned under trees. Hospitals received funding for medicines and equipment. The changes weren't perfect or complete, but they represented genuine progress toward the kind of society Alino had envisioned. Other West African countries experienced similar transformations. In Senegal, term limits were strengthened and corruption prosecutions increased dramatically. Former officials who had stolen public money were forced to return what they had taken, and many faced prison sentences. Nigeria's democracy was revitalized by an influx of young politicians who had cut their teeth organizing solidarity protests for Alino. They brought fresh ideas about technology, transparency, and citizen participation that began to modernize how government operated. Ghana became a model for the entire continent by establishing one of Africa's most effective anti-corruption systems. They created citizen oversight committees that monitored government spending and published regular reports that were accessible to ordinary people. Mali managed to negotiate peace agreements with rebel groups by applying lessons learned from the peaceful revolution movement. Instead of relying solely on military solutions, They addressed underlying grievances about inequality and marginalization that had fueled conflicts. The economic impact of these political changes was profound. Foreign investment increased as international businesses gained confidence in the region's improved governance and stability. Tourism grew as people felt safer visiting countries with more transparent and accountable governments. More importantly, domestic entrepreneurship flourished. Young people who had participated in the protest movements channeled their energy into starting businesses and social enterprises. They created jobs for their communities while solving local problems like food security, clean energy, and digital access. Ibrahim, who had led the Alino Faso movement after his friend's death, established a foundation focused on training young activists across Africa. The foundation taught peaceful resistance techniques, democratic organizing, and conflict resolution skills to a new generation of changemakers. Alino's death showed us that one person can spark a revolution, Ibrahim explained to a group of student leaders from across the continent. But sustaining change requires many people working together over many years. The revolution doesn't end when the dictator falls. It continues every day as we build the institutions and culture of democracy. The foundation's training,